my name is Margaret Wilder. I'm a professor in the Center for Latin American Studies and the School of Geography. And I want to welcome everyone and give everyone the bienvenidos a todos y todas. I am the chair of this year's Tinker Committee, and I'm really thrilled to get us going with our first Tinker Graduate Research in Latin America Roundtable with some fabulous presentations ahead of us. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for any advisors who are here, and certainly to students for being here and supporting this event. I wanted to just say a few words about the Tinker Foundation. The Tinker Foundation has provided support for around 40 years to the Latin American Studies Center. We have to reapply for it every so often, but fortunately, we've been fortunate to receive that funding. And the Tinker grants are super, super important. They provide support across campus, so interdisciplinary support, not just for the social sciences, but all across the campus for graduate research in Latin America. And moreover, another unique thing about the Tinker grants is that they provide funding for master's level research, which most grants do not necessarily cover, and also for early PhD research. And so it's a very unique grant that really gives students an opportunity to get into the field very early in their graduate careers and do actual original field research, which we'll hear about today. So thanks to the Tinker Foundation for its continued really critical support. It's allowed us in the past to fund people studying volcanoes, in different countries, studying archaeology, musicology, ethnobotany, pretty much you name it. We've had pharmacists, I think, definitely linguists, linguistic students. So lots of cool projects that all come together under the auspices of the Tinker grants. Just a reminder that next week will be round 2 of the Tinker Roundtables. Pardon me, and it will be at the same time next week. So with that, I am going to introduce Olivia Conklin, who is our first year student who has agreed to help out with moderating and organizing this session. I also want to acknowledge Clea Conlon and Andrea Bennett, who have been amazing in pulling this roundtable together. So Olivia, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Olivia. I'll be the moderator for today. So we have some super interesting presentations coming up. We'll be hearing from Adam Chmurzynski, Gabriela de la Cruz-Sanchez, Samuel Heywood, Andres Pantoja, and Luis Carrion. And I'll introduce them all separately, but first I just want to give some recognition to these panelists who have experienced some particularly difficult challenges due to COVID-19 and the hoops they've had to jump through in order to continue their field work, both in the field and possibly even virtually. So we're very happy to have them presenting here today. And we're going to be starting off with Adam Chmurzynski, and he researches in Costa Rica, and he studies analyzing the future of tropical dry forests using new technologies and low-cost laser scanning in ecology and evolutionary biology. So without further ado, Adam, please take it away.
All righty. Thanks a lot, Olivia. And I want to say a quick thanks to the Tinker Foundation and the School of Latin American Studies. I'm sure I'm not the only one who found this funding a huge boon in the months coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope you enjoy the quick rundown of my research and the summer I was able to have thanks to the School of Latin American Studies. So what you're seeing here is a landscape from northwestern Costa Rica in a seasonally dry tropical forest. We work in a national park called Santa Rosa National Park within a wider conservation area with sort of a distinguished history even within the very proud conservation tradition of Costa Rica. So here it might look sort of like a traditional tropical forest, but it's quite unique in that 6 months out of the year, very intense drought, rains, most of the tree community completely drops its leaves. And mirroring that, there's an extremely high diversity of plants that are adapted to these drought conditions, and insect communities that migrate over the Central Cordillera back and forth between the Caribbean rainforests and the wet season for this highly seasonal forest. So it's become a centerpiece of ecological research in the region because there's an outstanding question of whether a forest like this will be either resilient or particularly vulnerable to changes in temperatures and maybe an increase in the frequency of drought. So over and above that, this is a really highly threatened ecosystem. It's been reduced to a little less than 1% of its original range, normally extending all the way from southern Mexico down into South America along the western coast of Central America. So a lot has been done in this region in particular to conserve this unique ecosystem. So our research takes place in the context of Área de Conservación Guanacaste. So Guanacaste is the provincial region that contains this dry forest. It sort of has a unique history and a unique cultural identity within Costa Rica. For a long time in the 19th century, it was annexed by Nicaragua. And so the national forest that we work in actually contains a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's relevant to the political history of this region, how it's related to Costa Rica. And grown up around that is this very unique conservation effort where local managers who in many ways actually innovated the entire Costa Rican national park system and contributed to the way things are operated, were able to bring together a bunch of different patches extending from the Central Mountain Range here, which contains both Caribbean rainforest on up into cloud forest, and then as you move down towards the ocean, this gradient into tropical dry forest. So this is a really unique pattern in land conservation where the focus was on not only maintaining individual ecosystems, but also the connections between them, which are really critical to a lot of the seasonal migrations of species within this landscape. So we're really fortunate to be working here. There's a ton of conservation infrastructure and also a ton of biological knowledge accumulated over time that we're hoping to contribute to. So in terms of what we're actually doing, our project is framed around, and the main reason we're working here to this day is that in the 1970s, a group of ecologists installed a 15-hectare forest plot within Santa Rosa National Park. This plot was recensused in the 1990s, and then again last decade. I had originally proposed to then recensus it a fourth time, leading to over 40 years of long-term demographic data on the plant species, which is relatively unprecedented, especially in some of these tropical forests. So that long-term record is extremely valuable from an ecological point of view. So the first thing that we did was to go out and recensus this 15-hectare plot, which involved measuring the diameter of every woody stem greater than 1 centimeter at breast height, which corresponds to 1.3 meters from the ground. So every tree, every liana, every shrub that met our size criteria, we tagged and identified to species. And what we're now able to do is go back and link those data, going all the way back to the 70s, identify individuals that have survived to this day, also quantifying mortality, and eventually looking at shifts in the abundances of particular species and trying to link that to the physiology and variation in the physical traits of these different plant species, which is sort of the fundamental goal of my research. And what we can do then with those patterns is try to link the physiology of those species who are winning and losing to varying degrees to then changes in the climate. And try to get a sense for what the ultimate fate of these ecosystems will be, and forecast vulnerability to drought, and try to help folks make decisions about what to do with the landscape based on that. And so having recensused this plot of forest, we were able to integrate those data with an international network of forest plots run by the Smithsonian called Forest Geo. And we hope to be able to attract more research to this particular forest in Costa Rica and bring more attention to this ecosystem and the wonderful managers that have been stewards of this landscape for decades now and longer. And completing this work would have been utterly impossible without the faces you see here. Costa Rican forestry students who generally work near the capital, generally don't travel as far out as northwestern Costa Rica to the dry forest. We were conducting the census up until, or beginning in 2019. I personally was forced to evacuate when the pandemic began. These students, on the other hand, were able to remain and continue working in the forest under pandemic conditions once things had loosened up. And they're being able to do that and taking control of the research process, conducting all of the species identifications, going through the entire protocol, was just an absolute pleasure to see, and actually effectively allowed this work to get done within a reasonable amount of time. And for us to be able to support them during the difficult pandemic months was also an incredible win-win as well. So the title that Olivia read is related to laser scanning. And so you may be wondering what that has to do with anything. And to get more specific, my research has a lot more to do with quantifying the structure of individual tree species and using those measurements of the geometry of trees to get much better predictions for the rate of growth for different trees across a forest landscape. And so the way that you get those fine-scale geometric data are using these relatively advanced techniques, using laser scanners like you see here, which effectively operate on a swivel, spin around, and are able to scan discrete surfaces in the environment and then give back this kind of raw cloud of points here. We call it a point cloud. And then from this spatial data, you can extract some information on the environment, individual models of trees, and start to make predictions about their physiological functioning. As you can imagine, these machines are pretty sophisticated and also correspondingly expensive. So we're looking for ways to get the information that we need without having to rely on these expensive instruments like you see here. And so with the census completed, we're looking to get back out there and conduct more scanning work to compare these different types of techniques and try to make the workflow for doing this sort of thing more available and more democratic. And that's all I've got for you for today.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam. That was very interesting. Just to reiterate what I mentioned in the chat, we will be saving all questions for the end. We're going to let all presenters speak first. So just be sure if you have any questions for Adam or for the next presenters, you hold on to them until the end and then submit those questions in the question and answer section down at the bottom of the screen. And if you would like to mention who your question is for, that will help us direct, who the questions are going to. So just be sure to hold on to those questions until the end. Adam, thank you again. We're next going to move on. We are going to hear from Gabriela de la Cruz-Sanchez, who has conducted her fieldwork in Mexico, documenting the use of Otomi linguistics through her virtual research. So Gabriela, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm Gabriela de la Cruz, and my project is documenting the use of Otomi. So let's move. Okay, so Otomi is a Mexican language. It's spoken mainly in the center of the country, as we can see here in the map. It's spoken in different states, but I focus on the Western Otomi, which is spoken in the state of Mexico, next to Mexico City. This language has at least 22 different varieties, and we have classified them in 9 groups, but we are not sure whether we should consider them as just as varieties in groups, or if we should treat them as different languages. So the place where I did the study is the Maya. This is quite representative in the whole state of Mexico and for the Western Otomi, because in this community, we have the largest number of speakers. And even though we have the largest number of speakers in this area, little has been done about the language. And in fact, there are not many descriptions of this variety. So here we can see some differences, and even in the cloth, in the traditional cloth that people use. So the variety that I documented is this ñato. That's the name that the speakers use to refer to themselves. So here we can see the traditional cloth of the woman. This is another version of the cloth. As we can see, it's pretty much similar, except for the shoes and the shirt. And here we have another variety, which is the ñaño. And then we can see even the differences, right, in clothes. This ñaño is mostly spoken either in state of Hidalgo or Querétaro. And the ñaño is a little bit more documented in comparison to the ñato. So we can see that there are differences in the dress, in the way they dress, but there are also quite big differences in the language. So the objective of this data collection is to create a corpus to sketch the salient features of the language and to contribute to our understanding of the typology of the phonological and morphosemantic system of the language. So the participants in the methodology that I use here is I work with speakers from the Maya Otomi. All of them are adults that are fluent in Otomi and in Spanish. They are quite representative because nowadays in the community, it is hard to find monolingual speakers. So most people speak Otomi and Spanish at the same time. So all my informants are adult speakers, females and males. They are in their 60s, some in the earlier 60s, others in their late 60s. They have a basic level of education as most of the population, so they attend the primary level. And they use the language to communicate at home as happens with many other endangered languages. And they use also the language to communicate with the elders in the community, people that are over 80s, and have no formal training in Otomi. So they attended education, but the education they got in primary was in Spanish. So the methodology that I used were basically elicitations, interviews, grammatical judgments, and a lot of storytelling. The research I did was virtual. So I spent many hours in Zoom meetings with my speakers, with my informants. I used different programs, Zencaster, whatever whatever they could, whatever was easier for them to use, according to my informant. So that's what I did. I worked with some of them preferred video calls in WhatsApp or emails. So I basically recorded these conversations and the stories, the anecdotes. to analyze them. Oh, and I want to say something. So the pictures, these pictures that I am showing you here are quite representative in the area. If you go to the community, this is representative place for the culture, and each one of these buildings or constructions has a specific meaning for the Otomi people. So here we can see the Otomi people also working on some carpets. So the material that I obtained were basically recordings of stories and anecdotes. So I have here two examples of those anecdotes. So I have one story, which is the pig story. This anecdote, in this anecdote, it's about a man who plants his fields, but then pigs ruin them, you know. And so there's a whole story behind everything, and the informant explained how it happened, and I have another example, story 5, which is one of the informants was telling me about a rainy evening and a conversation that he listened between two taxi drivers in a rainy evening, and is reported by the passenger, which in this case is my informant. I also collected a list of words with contrastive sounds. I have a quite big list of words. I have a collection of verbs and toponyms that are still in progress. So I haven't collected all of them, but I have a big list already. And the result, well, after I got the anecdotes, for example, from the anecdotes, I was able to describe the morphosemantic characteristics of the noun phrases. And I wrote a paper that is definiteness into myotomy. This paper talks about the indefiniteness and the definiteness. And during the ALC 15 here at the University of Arizona, I talked about the indefiniteness. And I am going to present another paper in which another paper in which I'm going to describe the definiteness of the language in the University of Querétaro. Actually, this university works a lot with Otomanguean languages, so I am pretty excited, and I really want to hear what other researchers of Otomanguean languages have to say about my my findings. The isolated words that I collected are being analyzed. I haven't finished doing the analysis. So my objective here is to describe the vowel inventory of the language at a phonological level. And yeah, and I'm working on this paper. So here I have one example of the pig story, what I did with the story. So I closed the whole story, and then I analyzed the noun phrases. And what I'm doing right now is I'm working with the vowel inventory. So I'm plotting all the vowels of my participants, and I can kind of separate my analysis in males and females, because I think that is going to be more productive rather than collapsing everything in just one single chart. Well, it was a good experience. There were several challenges during the elicitation. But in the end, I think that the objectives were accomplished. I did notice that that all the material I collected is quite interesting, and there are many things that can be done with that same material. And then what is even more important is that the results contribute not only to our theoretical understanding of the language, but also in terms of second language acquisition and teaching. And well, much work needs to be done, and I plan to keep working on this because I want to analyze the language a little bit more and kind of focus on this kind of topics for my dissertation. And yeah, well, here I have another picture of the place. So if you ever want to visit that municipality, you can always go to this place, which is pretty cool. Well, thank you so much. I want to give special thanks also to the College of Social and Behavioral Science and the Latin American Studies Department. and to Dr. Marcela Vasquez Leon, to Dr. Colin Dietz, to Dr. Susana Brewer Osorio, and Clea Jane, Colleen, and everyone involved for all the help and all the emails, and you were always there supporting my project. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation, Gabriela. We're going to move on next to Sam Heywood. He is presenting on Mexico City and Dos Bocas and Mexico's collective memory. So Sam, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Awesome. Okay, so I've been experiencing some technical difficulties, so hope. Okay, you should hopefully be able to see my screen now. All right, awesome. Yeah, so I wanted to start with the image on the left there of perhaps some of you are familiar with it. It is of an oil fire that happened in the Gulf of Mexico this past summer in July. But the event that I'm studying happened over 100 years ago, also in Mexico, near the Gulf, in July of 1908 in Veracruz. And there was basically two massive craters opened up when there was pressure from an oil well below that became too much. And so two giant sinkholes appeared, and a plume of oil shot up in the air, over 200 feet tall. And oil began pouring out of this well at 90,000 barrels a day. And of course, back in 1908, they didn't really have the technology they do now to stop these things. So for 2 months, oil seeped out into the local ecosystem. That is, at the end of it all, it is estimated that there was 2 billion gallons of oil that was dumped everywhere, covered everything. For reference, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill that most people know about, that was only 210 million gallons of oil. And we know of the disastrous effect that had on the environment. But this is a scale that is exponentially more, 2 billion gallons. And not only was it just oil shooting into the air, but it also caught fire from the oil derrick, from the flames that were used to power the derrick. So it turned into a giant flaming pillar. It burned over 1,000 degrees. A newspaper from the city of Tampico that was over 40 miles away reported that people were walking in broad daylight, or it was like broad daylight in the middle of the night. They were reading the newspaper in the middle of the night because they could see from this light that was far away. People even reported being 200 miles away on the ocean and they could see the fire. The indigenous population, the local population, some of them were reported to have thought that it was Armageddon, that this was the end of the world. And for many of them who relied on the local fishing industry, it was the end of their world. They were completely displaced. So I discovered this reading. It was just literally one page in a book of environmental history of Latin America. And immediately the question just entered into my mind of what happened, why is it that we don't remember this as a world? And I also want to know, how do Mexicans perceive this event, and is it remembered or is it not? And so I went to Mexico City, and I figured a good place to start would be the Archivo Nacional, the National Archive, because it's literally, like, the subtitle of it is The Memory of Mexico. And so if I wanted to figure out, where this event stands in their memory, I think it was a good place to start. Now, I was a little intimidated. I've been in archives before, but the National Archive of Mexico is definitely a little more serious. It's the building there on the bottom left, the castle-like building. It used to be an old prison. I may have accidentally locked myself in a room at some point and had to call for help, but we won't get into that. But I was amazed going to this building and talking to the people, talking to the archivists, talking to historians, and none of them knew of this event. None of them knew or could tell me definitively of Dos Bocas. None of them could direct me to a box of documents entitled Dos Bocas. So I really just had to go general and collect as many documents as I could. I was in the National Archive, I was able to find some things, like the picture on the top right is one of the only pictures I've seen of the site. This is after the oil spill. You can see toxic gases are still rising up from the lagoon where the spill happened. But yes, I think that helped solidify, and as well as the many other Mexicans that I talked to while I was down there in Mexico City, asking about this event, that it is not remembered at all. So then the question becomes why, and what does that mean for Mexico's collective memory and for how they remember history. Unfortunately, there were difficulties, as I'm sure many others experienced in researching. Right as I arrived, there was a COVID spike in Mexico City, so things began shutting down again. Luckily, most archives stayed open. All libraries in the city closed, so there were a few places that I didn't get to visit in person, but I was surprised to find one of the most helpful places was the Pemex, the Mexico's national oil industry. They have an archive, and they had a lot of information, a lot of documents, reports, more pictures and testimonials, newspaper articles, all about Dos Bocas. And basically what I did while I was down there was creating my own archive, right? That's what a historian does, is taking pictures that you don't have nearly enough time to go through and digest all the documents in person. So you find things, you look for things that look relevant, you take pictures, and you just collect all this, as much information as you can. And so, yeah, I have government reports, I have pictures, testimonies, of course, newspaper articles, like I mentioned. And then I also spent a fair amount of time interviewing as many people as I can from as many different backgrounds as I could. I have interviews from teachers, from archivists, from a few historians, a few professors, students, and really even just people in the park. If I was sitting down and had an opportunity to talk with someone, just getting their perspective on these things. And of course, I'm still in the process of digesting all this information and interpreting it. But these are some of the conclusions that I'm working towards, or that I've been working on with the information I've collected. Primarily, this happened in 1908, and Mexico's revolution happened in 1910. The revolution to overthrow the despot Porfirio Diaz. And it was very important, just as it was under the Diaz regime. It was important for the revolutionaries to establish, a national narrative, and nationalism was extremely important. The picture on the bottom right is Lázaro Cárdenas. He was a president of the revolutionary government, and in 1938 he nationalized the oil industry, and oil became a very important sticking point for the government, almost a promotional thing for Mexico of their industry and their power. And it is, I believe that the Mexican government, the narrative that they established, it didn't allow for an event like Dos Bocas to happen, for this huge, massive, tragic event that ruined people's lives, that killed several people, that were some of the firefighters that tried to stop it. A Mexican newspaper, a national newspaper at the time that it happened, referred to it as the greatest and most terrible day in Mexican history. And I think that went against the national narrative of the oil industry is a source of power and a source of strength for our country. There's also something that plays into it, Mexico's growing conservation movement at the time. In 1910, sort of in parallel to the national park movement, conservation movement in the United States with Theodore Roosevelt, there was a growing movement in Mexico as well to establish national parks. Lázaro Cárdenas talked a lot about the role of national parks, and it's it is like there's been a lot of work done on conservation and how it is, you know, actually damaging in some ways to the environment, and can contrast with, you know, local narratives, people who are living in these areas, what they think. Yes, but so that is what I'm looking at as well, is the national narrative of Dos Bocas, which at the time when it first happened, of course, was a tragedy, but it's kind of let go over time nationally to where eventually now everyone I talked to, I couldn't find a single person in Mexico City or anyone I've talked to that, besides a few experts in historians who are literally like oil experts in Mexico, but almost everyone I've talked to doesn't know about this event. But what I've yet to do, what I'm working on now, is establishing, you know, what is the local narrative of this. So I was planning on from Mexico City traveling to Veracruz. Things were really, like I said, ramping up COVID wise, and so I didn't feel very comfortable extending my trip. So I came back to the States, but there is still part of my plan with the remaining funds that I have to travel back to Veracruz, possibly in January. And if that's not possible, then to do things digitally through interviews. But to go to Veracruz and to talk to the people there and see what their perspective is, visit a few local archives as well, and see, I've just heard a few things of that. There is still a local narrative that persists about Dos Bocas and what it means. And I want to see how that contrasts to, again, the national narrative which has completely forgotten it. You can see on the top left there's just an empty marker, a stone marker. That's not a marker of Dos Bocas. It's what I imagine it is like. I've read somewhere that there is a worn down stone marker that commemorates the Dos Bocas tragedy. And if I make it down to Veracruz, it's going to be my goal to find this stone and take a picture of it, because I think that illustrates, you know, perfectly what has happened to this event as time has gone on, and it doesn't fit into the narrative, and so it fades away. But there is still this monument. There is still something standing there that alludes to it. And finally, this is just for my master's thesis for the LAS program. But I do think that there is a lot more potential here to explore as far as broader themes of memory and power, and Mexico's collective memory and how they approach history. And specifically, I'm really interested in education as well. So if this is to go on to be a full dissertation for a PhD someday, then I would want to incorporate those things of, you know, how of course this event, the Dos Bocas event, isn't included in schools, but how does the Mexican education system handle controversial or problematic events in history, like the massacre that happened before the Olympics in the 1980s? How is that remembered and how is that covered? Yes, and so hopefully the person on the right there is Jose Vasconcelos. He's was one of the first secretaries of education under the revolutionary government, and he was very important in kind of establishing the educational narrative and the nationalism in schools in Mexico. So that is still in the future, but I'm happy with what I have, and still excited to get more information and to put it all together into hopefully a readable and interesting and important thesis. And of course, I would also like to thank my committee members, Jadwiga and Tonze and Dr. Beasley for their support and for guiding me. There are several contacts in Mexico, a fellow history student, Liliana, who's been instrumental in helping me and guiding me to sources and to the right place. So of course, this is a project that can't be done solo, and I'm very grateful for all the support I've received.
Great, thank you, Sam. All right, so next we're going to be moving on to Andres Pantoja. He conducts his research in Chile regarding extended techniques for the classical guitar in Chilean music. Andres, whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your screen and take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Hi all. My research is about extended techniques for the classical guitar in Chile. As you can see, this is about music. I research specifically Western classical music written for the Chilean guitar in Chile. And my research explored what are called extended techniques. But what are those extended techniques? When people think about classical music, they usually think about Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, or Chopin. And if you know some classical guitar music, they probably will know Tárrega, Sor, or Giuliani. Mostly European composers from the classical and romantic era. I mean around 1800s. All the music is made of traditional sound and have well-defined pitch or notes and could sound like this. This is the more traditional music. I'm going to show you a little bit. This would be something traditional. Okay, but during the second half of the 20th century, the paradigm changed and sounds that before were considered noise were used to make music. A variety of these sounds, produced in a non-traditional fashion, started to be included in compositions. This was the result of experimentation and new ideas about what is defined as music. So those novelty songs were called extended techniques. Some of them sound and are produced like this. This is, for example, the bitone. These are the harmonics. This is more bitone. So, and what led me to research this topic? I'm a classical guitarist from Chile. During my undergraduate studies, I began playing Chilean composition, and I had a great interest in playing Chilean classical music. And I have had the opportunity to know many Chilean composers as well. So for more than 15 years, I played many Chilean musical works, and I noticed that there was something in common among them. The music notation of those techniques in that repertoire was not consistent. And this inconsistency led to performers to confusion. So consistency in this case referred to the use of a standardized way of notating each extended technique. Since the musical notation is essential to communicate the composer's musical ideas to the performer, having a non-standardized notation makes the task of music reading very difficult, and in some cases probably impossible to elucidate. I was unable to find any publication about extended techniques in the Chilean repertoire, even though this technique has been part of the toolkit of many composers in Chile for decades. In the US and Europe, there are many publications about it. Since the 70s, scholars like Robert Loon, John Schneider, Wisnik, and many others have presented evidence of these techniques using contemporary works for guitar. So my research was motivated to help to fill this gap in the literature about extended techniques in the Chilean classical music for guitar. And with my fieldwork, I traveled to Chile to find out if what I had experienced as an inconsistency in the notation was an actual problem in the Chilean repertoire. And if so, what was the scope of that problem? So, about my fieldwork experience. I traveled to Chile in December 2020, which I returned ticket to March 2021, and I decided to travel because the border was opened, and at the end of November, Chile has apparently well controlled the pandemic and all this. but the COVID situation then changed during January. And there were new restrictions and for the mobility, and in my neighborhood was mostly in a restrictive stage. So it was difficult to commute, and due to this restriction, my original plan was delayed. So I had to stay like more months there. So in my methodology, I had to, I had to see, you can see a sequence. The first step for me was searching for music catalogs and to find out which were the Chilean works for guitar and who were those composers that composed those pieces. I complemented this with my own database of scores and information provided also for my personal contacts. Next, I collected the actual musical scores. The sources were diverse. My own collection, scores from other guitarists and composers' personal libraries, mainly because most of the libraries were closed during the beginning of this year. And also I used the web to collect these scores. Once I had the core, I began analyzing those scores collected to detect problems and inconsistencies in the notation of these extended techniques. All this process gave the necessary information to decide which composer or guitarist I had to interview. Based on my findings, I selected interviewees, and for instance, I analyzed musical works from Francisco Silva, Chilean composers, and I found many notational inconsistency and in 5 works. So it was necessary for me to interview him to clarify the meaning of those notations. The interviews were conducted in order to find out the meaning of the musical notation I consider unclear. They also provided more information about context of the composition, reasons for using those extended techniques, the inspiration taken from other music, and more literature related to my topic. Finally, by analyzing the data collected, I could corroborate actually my initial assumptions. So the results, sorry. Okay. So during my time in Chile, I found, here we go, a total of 555 works in databases. This corresponds to works written in Chile during the 20th century and 21st century. So this actually exceeds the scope of my research that was focusing only on the last 30 years. So in these last 30 years, I cataloged 216 works for or with guitar. So for guitar, with solo guitar, or with guitar. So works that, for ensemble, that has also the guitar. So these works were written by 54 composers, and I also I collected only like 166 scores, and 116 of those scores have one or more extended techniques. So there was a huge amount among these scores. So the use of notation was not consistent among those extended techniques. In some cases, I could determine the meaning of the notation because of the notes or glossaries added to the score. However, most of the composers used their own means to write, which in most cases led to confusion. So with this, let's say, state of affairs, I listed works which had extended techniques I could not decipher. The total were like 66 notational issues in 39 works of 21 composers. So I could interview 12 composers who had the most notational issues, and they willingly provided solutions to all my inquiries. So the rest of the composers had fewer minor issues or were simply unreachable. So I also interviewed 2 guitarists who were only performers, no composers, who were experts in contemporary music. They each provided insights about their understanding of extended techniques in this repertoire, and the music writing as well. So what is noteworthy is that only one interviewed composer mentioned that he uses like a book about musical notation for guitar as a reference. This book was called The Techniques of Guitar Playing by Seth Yossel. But the other composers I interviewed relied on notation of works composed in the past. Other created a new notation, other adapted the extant notation. So these features for me indicate that the notation of these techniques lacks standardization among the Chilean composers and probably among Spanish speakers composers. Since so far I have not found a literature about this topic in Spanish. But it's only an assumption right now, that part of my my results. So with this fieldwork, was very successful in providing an extended database, responses to my research questions, and ideas of possible outcomes from this research. The notation of extended techniques among composers in Chile is still a matter that needs to be addressed, I think, and my study, I think, that could contribute to clarify and very dispersed matter and establish, hopefully, a reference point to standardize this kind of musical notation. And also to make it easier and more effective, the communication between composers and performers. So I think also that the data collected will be a significant source for my doctoral dissertation and future projects about this matter, articles, or even a book about that. And there are also unsolved questions that arose during the interviews, such as, for example, which of those extended techniques has been borrowed from traditional South American music, or which from European music, or rock, or other genres. And in the same sense, how those composers has been influenced by their own musical heritage, or question that has to do more with music theory, like how these extended techniques has been incorporated in the music discourse, that could be from coloristic element or structural material. So that was my presentation. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Tinker Foundation also and LAS for providing this opportunity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andres, and to all of our presenters today. Unfortunately, Luis Carrion is unable to present today, so we apologize for any inconvenience to our attendees. But now we can move on to the question and answer section. So if you could please direct your questions to the question and answer box down at in the tabs on the bottom of your screen, and please say who you are addressing your question to, and then we will be relaying the questions to the different presenters. Yes, I see a question from Cecilia Moreno for Gabriela. And what is the question here? Let's see. Okay, so I see a question for Gabriela that says, which do you think is your starting point in your study of Otomi language, and how big do you think the amount of words this language could have? I'm assuming the language differences maybe, but go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready. And you can see the questions in the Q&A section as well.
Well, it is a little bit hard to give a starting point in the language. As I said before, there are different varieties of the language. Some of them have been documented already. However, I mean, we do have mutual intelligibility among the languages, but at some point, And then there are differences also in the language at different levels. So we have phonological differences, lexical differences. So what I tried to do with my project was to fulfill the morphosemantic description, because the NP hasn't been studied at that point. So that was, I could say that the morphosemantic description of the NP was my starting point. And yeah, I did contrast that information with other researchers and with other papers that were written like in the 90s, and with other varieties as well. But as I said, there are many differences in the language. So I think that studying the typology of it can give us more ideas whether we should consider all of them as varieties, or if we should start separating them and consider them different languages. As for how big the amount of words this language could have, well, to be honest, I don't really, I cannot say exactly. I can talk a little bit about the inventory of the language, like the vowel inventory or the consonant inventory. But this language, as all the languages, is evolving, right? And there are some borrowings, yeah, and some cultural aspects that have modified the language at different levels. Yeah, so as far as I know, there are not clear descriptions of the lexicography of the language of that in that area as well. So yeah, that's what I can say. I don't know if I answered your question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I see we have another question for Gabriela, but maybe to make sure the questions get spread around evenly, do we have any other questions for any of the other presenters before we direct the question back to Gabriela? I'll give a couple minutes to put any questions in the Q&A. I see, I have a question here from the chat for Andres from Dr. Wilder. She said, great presentation and lovely playing. What is at stake with the inconsistencies in musical notation? Are there implications for elsewhere in Latin America or globally?
Yeah, actually, the repertoire of the classical guitar is wide. There are thousands and thousands of works, let's say, written from the second half of the 20th century that present this kind of techniques, extended techniques. So I have been able to check, and I have been able to check a lot of literature about European repertoire and repertoire from the US as well, Latin America. But it's let's say that it's a work in progress, because I work with the last 30 years, and these inconsistencies has been present sometimes in European, let's say, European repertoire as well. So, for example, there are pieces written for guitar during the 80s and 90s that if you don't reach the composer to ask him how to interpret the score and the symbols, sometimes very difficult to figure out how to interpret the music. So, but in Europe and the US, there are a lot of literature about that, and there are books that we can use as reference, and the composer uses as reference to write their music. But in Latin America, I think that there is no. I know about works in Brazil, I know about works in Argentina as well that has these inconsistencies, but I haven't checked the repertoire. I haven't checked that. I haven't found actually this kind of study that I'm doing in Spanish. So I assume that probably in these countries there is not probably there are problems similar to the Chilean. I don't know if that responds the question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a question for Sam. Again, Gabriela, I have another question for you as well, but we'll try to spread around the questions a little bit first. So Sam, this question is from Dr. Pieper Mooney, and she said, thank you for everyone's great presentations. I would like to hear more detail about Samuel's project, specifically about methodology in oral history. How do you seek to approach the local narrative of the event?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, specifically in Veracruz, I was in emails with Mirna Santiago, who is kind of the expert I alluded to on Mexican oil. And she mentioned as well that this lagoon where this happened, where Dos Bocas happened, is still there, and there's still signs of the oil spill, hundreds of years later. It's kind of referred to as like a big stinky. And so, and I remember I lived for a while in Tampico, Mexico, and there were people who, there were a lot of different people who worked for the oil industry and had different opinions on the oil industry. So methodology, if I make it to Veracruz, or if I'm able to just talk to more people virtually in Veracruz, would be asking about people who live there and who know of this place. What do they think of it? Do they know any more of the history? People who work for the oil industry, what is their opinion on the future of the oil industry? The younger generation, what do they see as the future of the oil industry? I do think that there is a slightly different narrative, even if I completely remember Dos Bocas. I think it will be a different flavor just because of locally where they're situated and the importance of the oil industry. And so that's what I'm going to seek to uncover by going there.
Great, thank you very much. And now I have a question for Adam, also from Dr. Wilder. She said, Adam, why did the forest get reduced to only 1% of its original extent? What were the drivers? What changes have been observed over the decades within the research plot?
Yeah, great question. I think the drivers were pretty comparable to what we see in tropical landscapes around the world, more or less having to do with selective logging, especially of the more valuable hardwood species, but also sort of broad scale clearing for agriculture and pasture lands. And that's happened repeatedly sort of over the past 200 or 300 years. So one of the bright spots has been there's a strong research tradition in restoration ecology and dry forest restoration in the national park that we work in, specifically, with a particular anecdote related to some wheeling and dealing with a nearby orange plantation where they end up with tons and tons of spare orange peels and don't necessarily know what to do with them a lot of the time. So at one point, bare pasture was covered in literally 6 to 10 feet of orange peels and simply left to sit. In doing that, you basically suppress the grasses that move in when you transition to pasture lands. And then some of the broadleaf tree species are able to germinate in tandem with the nutrient pulse that you get from the decomposition of the orange peels and effectively accelerate the transition back from pasture into dry forest. And so our own plots in the first half of the 20th century were also mixed agricultural use lands. There's old papaya trees that you can still find growing and that we measured some of to include in our census. So we've seen broadly an opportunity for these forest patches to succeed from pasture lands, then into secondary forest, and then starting to transition back into primary forest with some of the oldest and largest trees. So there's signs of recovery and also a growing base of knowledge of how to usher that process along. But yeah, so these landscapes can really be transformed, which is encouraging.
Great, thank you. And so now we'll move back to Cecilia's question. Cecilia, thank you for your patience. Cecilia asked Gabriela, did you interview people mostly in their 60s because the younger generations don't speak the Otomi, or why? What was your choice for interviewing people in their 60s primarily?
Well, it is true that it is less common to find younger people who speak the language. Like it will be almost impossible to find children who speak the language. But also because I have done previous research about generational, I have done generational studies about the language, and I have noticed that there are some generations that tend to use more borrowings or more words in Spanish due to the fact that they're that Spanish is probably the language that they use more often. They are more in contact with the language. So people who are in their 60s seem to be fully monolingual in both. And they seem to have also, they master pretty well the Otomi, and then they are more in contact also with elders. So since I wanted to have like a good quality of oral production and to be able to document the bowel inventory, that's why I decided to work with the people who are 60 years old or over.
Great, thank you so much. I have a couple questions myself for some of the presenters, but if any of the attendees have any more questions, I'll prioritize those. So if any of the attendees have any questions that they would like to address in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A section, I'll give you a couple minutes to do so, but if not, I'll go ahead with my own questions as well. So I'll just give a couple minutes there first. All right, it looks like I can go ahead and ask, but again, feel free, any of the attendees, if you have any final questions, please put those in the Q&A. My question for Andres, you mentioned a call for standardization in the notation of the extended techniques, and that some of the composers followed particular books in order to understand their notation. What would the standardization look like potentially for the composers to achieve that?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. You know, the notation is like also usually taken from the first work that used that notation, and that is a point of reference. And I found in Chile, like a couple of composers that I interviewed has a very, very clear notation, and also they had some experience studying abroad. One of them in Germany, the other in the US. One of them uses a book as a reference, a book that contains dozens of works that has been referenced for the classical guitarists, because include new extended techniques. There has been the first works with those extended techniques and has been used as a reference for this notation. So an extenderization of this in the Chilean case would be, the ideal case would be that they use the same notation that was used in the past, in the second half of the 20th century, to write those extended techniques. They are more or less standardized in Europe. So I think that I could, with my study, I could take the new notations I also found in the new extended techniques I found in Chile and try to find a new standardized notation, which it should be different than the others notation. That's the ideal, not having like the same symbols to refer to one extended techniques. It has to be different. That's my.
Great, thank you so much. And then I just have one final question for Sam, if nobody else has any questions in the question and answer section. Sam, you mentioned how the oil spill occurred in 1908, 2 years before the revolution, and how the nationalization related to the revolution could have overshadowed the memory of the event. Was there any indication from your studies that the revolution itself and that the casualties and the destruction of the revolution could have also potentially overshadowed the trauma of the oil spill in addition to the cultural attitudes?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question. That's an issue I really explored a lot more. I was taking a history class with Dr. Ortiz in the history department about revolutions and was able to kind of dive into that, like the real effect of the revolution on Dos Bocas. And yeah, I mean, in addition to the revolution itself disrupting kind of the memory, I mean, at the time when it happened, you had the Porfirio Diaz kind of trying to spin the narrative as well. I mean, the stuff I could find about him addressing the oil spill, he declares it as a positive. He tries to say, or he does say that this is not a disaster. This is showcasing how much oil there is in Mexico. We're basically open for business, and investors should invest. And I think a similar kind of narrative developed in Mexico as well, except it wasn't, they weren't about attracting foreign investors anymore, foreign companies. It was about, their own Pemex and their own industry taking control. But yeah, I mean, the Mexican Revolution, of course, was a very chaotic time with, it's a very complex time with many different sides and a lot going on and a lot of conflict. And so, yeah, I'm sure to some degree the conflict itself also overshadowed this massive event.
Great, thank you so much. Well, if there's any final questions, I don't see anything in the Q&A section or in the chat. So Dr. Wilder, if you want to take over.
Yeah, so I just want to thank the incredible 4 speakers that we had: Adam, Gabriela, Sam, and Andres. Really fascinating work. I have a lot of notes here and really learned a lot from all 4 of your talks. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I would really like to compliment Olivia Conklin on a wonderful job moderating this session. She stepped up very eagerly and just did a marvelous job. Really appreciate that. Again, Clea and Andrea and all the folks at the Latin American Studies Center, Jadwiga Piper Mooney, who is our current director, interim director of the center right now. So we really appreciate her support, and Colin, of course. So just one last reminder that next week, same time, same place, we will be here with round 2 of our Tinker Roundtables with 5 more wonderful talks coming from Paraguay, Guanajuato, Mexico, Costa Rica, and Brazil. So it should be a fun afternoon next Friday. Anything else, Clea, that I'm missing before we dismiss folks? Okay. All right, so gracias a todos y todas, and everyone have a great weekend. Be sure to take some time off this weekend. All right, thank you all. It was wonderful. Bye-bye.